as disciples. A life sought after earthly gain will not produce Christ-like behavior. Will not. Christ obviously did not seek after earthly gain, right? He didn't have a place to live. He lived for the eternal, spiritual purposes. Namely, Christ's intent was the redemption of souls. He said, I came to seek and to save that which are lost. Friends, the mark of a spiritual church, the mark of a mature church, the mark of a spiritual or a mature individual is not how much stuff God has blessed them with. It sickens me to see that preached today. Just the other night, I was watching a religious station, and there was a preacher. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He is a false teacher. His name is Joseph Prince. First time I ever heard him. Very dynamic person. He spent the entire message preaching that the reason why people are sick is because they just doubt too much. I turned to Bonnie and I said, what happens when he gets sick? Boy, that kind of ruins his entire ministry, doesn't it?
Amen. Amen.
That's false teaching.
That's right. Amen.
He used this all convoluted path through the Old Testament scriptures and twisting and turning to come to this conclusion. And it was he was very dynamic, very interesting, very wrong. That is not the evidence of a spiritually mature person. Wealth and health and prosperity. Jesus was poor. Peter's mother-in-law was sick. Paul had a thorn in the flesh. These people were far more spiritual than these guys, these charlatans that stand up and say such things. The sign, the mark of a spiritually mature church is not how big they are either.
That's right.
It's not size. It's not how much programs they have compared to other churches. The mark of a spiritually mature church is how Christ-like they are.
Amen.
That is the mark of a spiritually mature church. Let that be the thermometer gauge for Grace Baptist Church. Christ-likeness. He turns to his disciples and he warns that what will still Christ-likeness is greed and covetousness. Making your life consist of the treasures. We looked at the parable 2 weeks ago of the rich fool. That's what he made his life all about. The stuff of this world. And he was a fool because of it. This is what this parable is about. It's about the importance of using earthly treasures not to store up blessings and comfort for this life, but rather the extreme value of using earthly resources for eternal joy. I hope to be able to explain this as we look at this parable. First, let's look at this interpretation, look at the story here, and then look at the interpretation of it. It is a mistake to try to allegorize and assign spiritual personages to the persons in this parable. That's a mistake. The rich man, the steward, or the manager, the Lord's debtors, they do not represent different personages. Neither the church, nor God, nor Jesus, nor the angels, nor the disciples, as some interpreters have tried to say. They represent different individuals. No, they're just a story God is using to teach the disciples about using earthly treasure, using earthly things. So in this story, we have this wealthy man, probably a landowner, as that was the principal form of wealth in the culture and time. He had hired a manager. This manager is an independent contractor. He's not a servant, not a slave. If he were, the penalty for wasting his master's goods would be far different than getting fired. The penalty would be tormentors. The penalty would be debtor's prison. The penalty would be a lot more harsh. This was an agent hired by the man to oversee his many different investings that he had. So he hires this manager to handle the vast amounts of wealth he had. In this time of this parable, as well as today, the manager was hired to fully represent the owner. He was not a servant or slave, as I said before. Historical report written, one individual wrote it this way: what the agent does is as if the master did it himself. So that's why he had the authority to go and to wipe out the debts before he was fired. It was binding, legally binding if the agent did it. So you'd want a good, trustworthy agent. He spoke for you. He spoke on your behalf. It's no surprise that it is no surprise the steward was able to last as long as he did. I mean, it is a surprise to me in all of his foolish dealings, but he lasted quite a while. And finally the master hears that through the grapevine somehow that this steward, this agent, is manipulating. He is somehow wasting or being a very poor agent. He's doing a bad job. He needs to be fired. That's what this story basically says. So he says, bring your books. We're going to have an accounting session. And then he says to him, and then you're not going to be my steward anymore. The end is already secure. He already knows what's going to happen. He knows he wastes his good. By the way, some have said, well, that's because he was living it up off the master's goods. It wasn't because he'd been living it up off the master's goods. Otherwise, he wouldn't be afraid of being poor. He basically was just doing a bad job. He was just doing a bad job. So, he hears this. The master tells him he sends word to him that when he comes, he's out of a job. And he looks, he says, I can't dig. I'm not able to do that. That's not the kind of work I can do. And I can't go beg. I can't be brought that low. What am I going to do? So he calls every one of the Lord's debtors, the master's debtors, those that owed him money. And he sat down to the first one. And these two are just given as examples. I think there were more than this given. And the story is it's a fictional story. It doesn't have to go into great detail. Okay? His first one, he says, how much do you owe? And he tells him how much he owes, and he says, cut it in half. Wow, that's very generous. 50% reduction in my debt? Great. The next one, he calls him in, he says, how much do you owe? And he says, so much, and he says, cut it by 20%. Write down 80 instead of 100. Wow, that's generous. That pretty much helps me get on my feet again. And I believe he did that time and time again. And basically, he didn't take money for himself. He set up for himself a network of people that would appreciate him. Because when he gets fired, knock, 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 remember when I cut your debt in half? I'm kind of hungry. That's the whole purpose of what he does. He says, I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses, so I can come and stay with them. You see, in this Eastern culture, it still is this way today, gifts really always had strings attached to them. The gifts were given with the intent or expectation that they would be repaid in time. Which I find it interesting. That was the culture. By the way, I'm not saying the culture was right, but that was the culture. It's kind of that way today, even though we like to pretend it's not that way in our culture, but it is. However, I find it interesting that the Jews were so surprised, and the Romans were so surprised when the early church just gave of their goods to one another when they had need. And they were so surprised. What is this thing they're doing? Every man parts to him as he has needs without strings attached. And then you find out over and over again in the epistles and letters, James and Paul and others and John write about the importance of loving indeed. Loving with pure motives. Probably because this was a cultural problem. People didn't love with pure motives. So this man, he does what any person who's looking for the survival of his life would do. He finds a way to survive. Jesus, by the way, this is where it gets difficult. Because look and see what happens in verse 8. The Lord, that's not talking about Jesus, that's the Lord, the Master. Okay, in the story, we're still in the story here. The Lord commends the unjust steward because he had done wisely. Wait a second, he just robbed him of half of his profits. At least. And he commends him for it. I have a hard time fully understanding this. But if you think about it, this is sometimes done, even today. Respect for the enemy. Reverence for the one who well played, however, I don't like what you did, but well played. That's the idea here. The master looks out and he says, good play. He was able to recognize, I wonder if the master didn't look back and say, why didn't you act this shrewdly when you were my agent? But this is well played. That's the idea of commending it. You played it well. You took care of yourself. You did well. Now this is what makes this so difficult. You would expect the Lord to go on to a tirade at this point of how wicked the servant was, or the agent was, and how the master should have commended him, but he doesn't.